Cameron, do you want to stop sharing while I introduce you?
Sure. Let me do that right now.
Welcome, students, colleagues, and friends. I'm very excited to introduce my longtime friend and esteemed colleague, Dr. Cameron Monroe. And Dr. Monroe and I first met in 1994 when we were undergraduate students working together in the field at the Flowerdew 100 Plantation Archaeological Field School. Flowerdew 100 is a site that's in our own backyard. It's located in Hopewell, Virginia, just about 36 miles from Richmond. Our journey into archaeology began under the guidance of our favorite professor, Dr. Jim Dietz, at the University of California, Berkeley. Jim had an uncanny ability to ignite the passion for archaeology within his students, a spark that I'm sure ignited our shared enthusiasm for archaeology and African studies. Cameron completed his undergraduate studies at UC Berkeley in 1995 and went on to earn his master's and PhD from UCLA in 2003. Since 2006, he has been a valuable member of the Department of Anthropology at UC Santa Cruz. Throughout his career, Cameron has conducted extensive archaeological research in all parts of the world, from Armenia to Belize, Haiti, Israel, Sudan, and different parts of the United States. Tonight, we have the privilege of hearing about his remarkable work in Benin, which he will discuss shortly. Cameron's research primarily delves into political, economic, and cultural transformations in West Africa and the diaspora during the era of the transatlantic slave trade. Notably, he has directed the Abomey Plateau archaeological project in the Republic of Benin, a long-term endeavor that has yielded invaluable insights. Tonight, Dr. Monroe's presentation will revolve around his work in Benin, a topic that promises to be both enlightening and thought-provoking. His talk, titled Kings, Queens, Commoners, and Captives: What Can Archaeology Tell Us About Dahomean Society in the Era of the Transatlantic Slave Trade, is part of the African Archaeological Speaker Series and has been made possible through the sponsorship of the Archaeological Institute of America, the DC Society, and the Howard University Center for African Studies, my own Department of African Studies, the Department of Political Science at Howard, and the Archaeology Working Group at Howard. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming the distinguished Dr. Cameron Monroe.
Thank you so much, Flory. Now I have to figure out how to get back to sharing my screen. So please give me 1 second. Okay. So Flory, I didn't know you were going to talk about Jim. You made me all emotional. Being a student at UC Berkeley back in the 90s was an incredible opportunity, and it was, of course, extremely formative for me. It was a bit of a surprise for those students in the room. I grew up in Berkeley. My parents are actually in the room, so you have to be nice to me. I grew up in Berkeley and went to UC Berkeley, and I was always interested in archaeology. I was always interested in history. And when I first started studying archaeology at Cal, I thought that I was going to go into classics or Egyptology or Near Eastern studies or something like that. But my first experience with the African diaspora was at Flowerdew 100, studying the history of a plantation, deeply entrenched in slavery and the history of plantation slavery since the early 17th century. And that opened my eye to a whole world that I knew very little about and that I wanted to learn more about. And so in graduate school, I decided to sort of wed my interest in large-scale kingdoms and states with research on how archaeology can tell us something profound about Africa's engagement with the broader world in the era of the transatlantic slave trade. And so I sort of bumbled around looking for a research topic and ended up getting encouraged by my then advisor, Marek Poznański, to go off to the Republic of Benin, a place that sadly I knew very little about at that point in my life. So I flew off to Benin And 25 years later, I'm still doing field work there. So it's a story of sort of accidents and unintended consequences, but it's a place that I found is so incredibly important for our understanding of the emergence of Africa in the modern world, for the agency of kings, commoners, and others in West Africa and the diaspora. And the thing that I want to talk about today is how archaeology can say something quite interesting that allows us to unpack the complex dynamics of this particular place and this particular historical moment. So Dahomey is a place that's been studied by a lot of historians, by a lot of anthropologists, by a lot of art historians and others. It's sort of an iconic place in our understanding of West Africa and the era of the slave trade. But archaeology has sort of, it's been slow growing, and we're just beginning to get a better sense of how material remains recovered from a variety of different contexts can open our eyes to the complex dynamics of everyday people's lives in this extremely problematic and fraught period of human history. So what I'm going to try to do today, and I think it's probably going to be too much, so I might have to rush through the last section, but these are my goals. We always lay out goals in lectures like this, and then we have to truncate things. So forgive me if I have to truncate the end. But what I'm hoping to do is very briefly introduce what we know, or what we think we know, largely from the historical record about Dahomean society and the era of the transatlantic slave trade. This might be a review for some, and I'm really just going to hit the high points, mainly to frame some of the key questions that I've been asking with the archaeological record. I'm then going to introduce some of the archaeological work that I've done, which looks at evidence for the emergence of the state at a regional level, the expansion of Dahomey into its countryside, and the control and management of the slave trade. I'm going to then shift gears and focus on the everyday lives of people living behind palace walls, key administrators, officials, and soldiers that managed the affairs of the state from the 18th into the 19th century. And then hopefully I'm going to get to some recent work I've been doing on rural responses to state expansion, to add a perspective from the everyday lives of commoners who were sort of swept up and impacted with both the slave trade as well as Dahomean state formation in this period. Those are my lofty goals today, and I hope that I can get to all four of those objectives. So let's talk briefly about Dahomey in the era of the transatlantic slave trade. Again, Dahomey is a kingdom that's been studied by hundreds of people. It's one of the most studied kingdoms in West Africa in this period. But I want to highlight a few important pieces of background as well as historical transitions that frame the work that I've been doing there for the last 2 decades. We know quite a bit about the early history of the region from historical records, a little bit less so from archaeology. But what we do know is at the dawn of the Atlantic era, when European slave traders first started plying the coasts of the Bight of Benin, the region was dotted by large-scale cities, smaller rural communities, villages along the coast. And these communities were tied into an east-western lagoon trade, moving goods and resources across the coast of the Bight of Benin. These coastal communities were tied into urban centers that in turn were tied into long-distance trade networks with Sahelian states far to the north. So this was a region that was very much tied into broader economic and trade networks that extended all the way up into the rest of West Africa. In what is today southern Benin, the dominant 3 kingdoms starting in the 17th century were the kingdoms of Alada, Weda, and what became known as Dahomey. Alada and Weda we know quite a bit about from the historical record of the 17th century. These were large-scale kingdoms centered at expansive royal capitals, and they engaged directly in the transatlantic slave trade with Europeans through port towns like Jakin and Weda, respectively. Dahomey we know less about from the historical record because contact with Europeans was indirect. Dahomey was located on what is now referred to as the Abomey Plateau on the north, and it emerged as a major supplier for the coastal trade in captives in the 17th century, usually through its militaristic expansion. Now, as the oft-cited story goes, in the early 18th century, Dahomean monarchs, dissatisfied with being a middleman in the transatlantic slave trade, marched south. They conquered Alada and Weta in a series of military campaigns, and they expanded their sovereignty across the territories of all three kingdoms. Over the course of the 18th century, they built a complex bureaucratic state apparatus to manage and profit from the transatlantic slave trade. And then they pushed farther to the north and into the east into the 19th century to expand their hegemony over neighboring territories. Now, of course, the transatlantic slave trade was a huge component of the wealth, or provided a huge component of the wealth that allowed the Kingdom of Dahomey to thrive and expand during this period. The Transatlantic Slave Trade database estimates that over 500,000 captives were taken from this region of West Africa over the course of the history of the slave trade. And at least half of those came from the period when the kingdom controlled Weta on the coast, well into the 19th century. In exchange for captives, Dahomean monarchs accepted a variety of imported goods, things like guns, gunpowder, silk textiles, beads, brass kettles, cowrie shells, etc., etc. And those material items fueled a palace political economy dependent on the display of prestige and display and distribution even of prestige goods in royal ceremonies. So they played a really important role in symbolically underwriting the power and authority of the state in this period. While Dahomey's wealth came largely from transactions in human beings in the 18th century, by the 19th century, Dahomey struggled to successfully transition towards a legitimate trade in palm oil. And this was largely forced on Dahomey by abolition and the British blockade of the West African coastline. But Dahomey, unlike many other states in the region, managed to readapt its economy, ruralize its political economy, and develop new bureaucratic institutions that could manage trade and agricultural products. And it weathered that transition successfully, maintaining its authority over the region well into the 19th century, just on the eve of the scramble for Africa. Now, in my title, I mentioned that I was going to talk about what we can tell, archaeology contribute to our understanding of Dahomean society. And there's some key status or social groups that we have to think about before I can jump into that data. On the one hand, there's the Dahomean political elite. And the political elite included both the so-called Agasuvi. This is the king and the royal family and the nobility. This was a royal dynasty united by claims to an ancestral union between a mythical leopard Agasu and the princess Aligbonu from the town of Tado in today's Togo. And then bureaucrats. These were high-ranking officials who organized and managed the various affairs of the state. And most of these bureaucrats were drawn from the common class, commoners across the kingdom. One of the more interesting aspects of Dahomean society that's often talked about in the literature are Dahomean palace women. And behind the palace walls, anywhere from 2 to 3 or even 4,000 women lived that provided a range of functions and services for the state as a whole. Many of these titles are described here, both in English and Fon: the Queen Mother, Pojito, the Queen and the Royal Wives, or Ahosi, including female ministers and administrators who provided many official functions for the state, princesses, tassinos, who were incarnation of past queen mothers, and importantly, and people like to focus on this category of women quite frequently, female soldiers, the so-called Amazons, who are referred to in the historical literature sometimes as Ahosi, wives of the king, or Mino, or most recently Agojie. in films like The Woman King. And of course, the Agogie are, again, off-sided representations of the military power of the Dahomean state. Dalzell wrote in the late 18th century, within the walls of the different royal palaces in Dahomey are immured not less than 3,000 women. Several hundred of these are trained in the use of arms under a female general and subordinate to officers appointed by the king in the same manner as those under the Agao, and that's the Minister of War. Again, importantly, these women have been glorified and brought to world attention in the recent film, The Woman King, which we can talk about in the Q&A. There's wonderful things about the film and historically questionable things about the film as well. Beyond that group of people, who I refer to in my publications as the royal palace sphere, people associated with managing the state in a variety of capacity, outside the palace walls, numerous social categories of Dahomean non-elite thrived. On the one hand, you have free commoners called anato, who were merchants, farmers, and craftspeople. And then on the other hand, you had enslaved people, referred to as kanumonhiho, or people of the cord. And in Dahomey, like many parts of West Africa, slaves served a variety of different functions. And here's just a handful of different activities with separate titles that enslaved people might be charged with, drawn from Boniface Obicheri's article from 1978. And the broad pattern of slavery in Dahomey sort of mirrors the pattern of slavery and enslavement in West Africa more broadly. This was a category that was relatively socially flexible. In Dahomey, unlike in other parts of West Africa, there were no slave lineages, but enslaved people would adopt the lineages of people who claimed to own their labor. And so there was a great deal of social flexibility, and over time, people would actually sort of become identified with that lineage. And so people would become incorporated into communities, families, lineages over time. And this group of people is really hard to see archaeologically. It's something that Africanist archaeologists have struggled with forever because of the social fluidity, and particularly the fluidity in residential status between enslaved people and free people in places like Dahomey. It's hard to see where, individuals who might have been identified as slaves lived in the archaeological record. One of the important things I want to highlight, coming back to the question of palace women, because this will be an important part of my talk a little bit later, is that we tend to describe palace women as elite, and that's actually sort of a misnomer, right? Movies like The Woman King, talk about elite women, and there's been a lot of research on elite women behind the palace walls. But it's worth noting that probably the majority of women who lived within royal palaces in Dahomey fit somewhere closer within the spectrum of identities that might be called enslaved. Right? We know from the historical record that in the process of Dahomean political expansion, many women were pulled from villages and towns across areas they conquered and brought into the palace sphere to provide those sorts of services that I described earlier. And so Skirchley in the late 18th century notes that the king issued a decree summoning every subject to present his daughters above a certain age at the court on an appointed day. There he selected the most promising of the children of the upper 10 and created them officers, while the lower orders were dubbed soldiers, and the children of slave parents became the slaves of the Amazon within the palace. Similarly, oral histories that I've collected on the Abomey Plateau talk about the incorporation of women captured during slave raids and wars with neighboring states into the royal palace sphere. This is an interview with a family from Kana Tota that I'll come back to in a little bit, where they indicate one of their ancestors was a woman named Nan Zoidi. She was a young girl who King Agaja brought from Arakplame following his return from a war against Oyo. Agaja took this girl as a wife and installed her at Kana Tota. Right, so women living behind palace walls really reflect sort of the complexities of Dahomean society as a whole. You have elites and you have a lot of non-elites. It really was a microcosm of the kingdom as a whole. And we should caution against seeing palace women as elite. In reality, many, if not most of them, fit along that spectrum of enslaved social status. So a number of years ago, I don't like counting anymore because it makes me feel old, but I guess back in the year 2000, I first got fascinated with this particular society, and having read so much of the history and the anthropology and the art history about Dahomey, I kept asking, where is the archaeology? Why is nobody going out and looking at these sites and trying to, tease apart the cultural histories and political histories of Dahomey from a material perspective, an archaeological material perspective, I should say. So way back as a graduate student at UCLA, I started the Abomey Plateau archaeological project, and with a brief hiatus while I was doing field work in Haiti recently, I've been working on and off that project, or leading that project on and off ever since. And the project, over the time, the research questions have evolved, but generally, these are sort of the things I'm sort of wrestling with in trying to use archaeology to study this particular context. On the one hand, I've been very interested in understanding how Dahomey laid claim to its territories and what sorts of administrative structures and social identities were established in the process. Like, how did Dahomey build a state, and who were the people that were involved, and how can we see those social identities emerge? And also, how did local communities respond and adapt to the emergence of Dahomean hegemony, right? And that's something I've just been beginning to get to, and hopefully I'll get to show you some slides about some preliminary results at the end. And doing this kind of research really requires a multidisciplinary perspective, and so I depend a lot on documentary work. I don't do my own archival work, but I depend on documentary work that other, extremely competent historians have done for the last 100 years. I do a lot of oral history work, and I work a lot with images to try to help me make sense of the material record that I find and contextualize things a little bit better. Most of the work is dependent on regional archaeological survey, and then also what's often called low impact archaeological site survey and excavation, and I'll talk about some of that in a bit. So, in thinking about the archaeology of political expansion, during my first trip to Benin to study Dahomey, once you land in Abomey and you start talking to anyone, you very soon learn that the palace at Abomey was the center of all things political. Right? The Abomey Palace, which is today a historical museum, is a place where the bureaucrats met to discuss issues of state. Right, the Agogie lived, right? So an entire military contingent, women bureaucrats lived as well. The king lived and held court. This was a center of the Dahomean political cosmology. And the way it was planned and organized reflects a lot of the sorts of activities that were going on at this site in the past. So briefly, I just want to talk about sort of the ground plan of the palace site, just to highlight some of its political importance. And then I'll come back to this theme actually a little bit later in the course. On the exterior of royal palaces was an area called the Singboji. I often just refer to this as a public square. This is, again, the exterior of the palace. This is the place where the kings and the royal family would hold large events called the annual customs, often involving the distribution of wealth to commoners and officials alike. And so these were places where the state could interface with the general public and show off all of its power and wealth in an annual set of ceremonies. Inside the palace, and we see this at a number of palace complexes that I'll talk about a little bit later, there were a series of courtyards that historically are very well described, and they seem to be used for very specific functions. And this set of courtyards, it's really three courtyards, the Poroji, Agodomen, and the Jalalahenu. And just for convenience, I just call this the KAJ complex. Right, three courtyards with each king in this particular context would engage in a variety of political activities. In the Poroji, this is like the first courtyard you would enter when going to visit the king. This is often a reception courtyard, a place where visitors would wait, but it's also a place where other kinds of political and public events would take place. Often adjacent to the Poroji was constructed a courtyard called the Abomey. This is a ritual courtyard which held these structures called jeho. These are sometimes actual tombs, more generally symbolic tombs for the kings and the wives of the king of each palace constructed. So lots of ritual activities taking place in there. And then farther in the interior is the Jalala Henu. And the Jalala Henu was a more ceremonial courtyard. This is a place where politicians and bureaucrats and others would meet to discuss matters of state. Ceremonies would be held. And this is really like a key political locus of activity within the royal palace. This is where all the politics was happening. I say politics, but I should really say the public politics, the way the state is interfacing with the broader public in the kingdom. In the interior of the royal palace, and this is again the palace at Abomey, you have a vast complex of domestic spaces. This palace interior was a place that outsiders were never allowed to visit, and women of the interior very rarely left. Norris writes, the apartments for the women, each of whom have separate huts, occupy, I believe, the remainder of the space within the palace walls, except a small part appropriated to the eunuchs for holding the provisions of his numerous family, as well as for his cowries, iron bars, clothes, arms, munitions, etc. So we know quite a bit about the palace at Abomey from historical and ethnographic and architectural architectural research. What I was struck by is in the historical literature, there's also quite a few references to royal palaces outside of Abomey. And here are just a few, but there's dozens of them. When European visitors traveled to Dahomey, they noted where there was a quote-unquote royal residence or a palace structure. And they're of differing size and differing quality, but they're usually completely overlooked until folks get either to Kana, which had a numerous set of palaces in the 18th and 19th centuries, or on to Abomey itself. So, you know, for the students in the room, when you're doing research on, you're thinking about historical research, or you're thinking about archaeological research, it's always wonderful when you find your opportunity to make the contribution. And when I was doing this historical work in grad school, I was like, I want to find those things. Like, where are those? And how can they tell me about what Dahomey is doing at the regional level and how it's instituting its power across the region? So I went to Benin way back when with a little grant and spent a lot of money at the Institut Géographique National to buy aerial photos. This was well back before Google Earth, and we couldn't, just look things up on our cell phone. You had to go into an office and buy the actual photographs. It was a 3-month project, and I waited for 2 months for the photographs to be sent to me. And sure enough, when I started looking at those photographs and also doing some oral history work and just riding around with a motorcycle across the landscape, we found something on the order of 27 palace sites distributed across the region, all over the Abomey Plateau. And this is probably one of the better preserved ones that I took with the drone recently. Very clear palace walls, and then the interior would have been that dense sort of domestic zone. And here you can see faintly some vegetation that reflects that KAJ complex right there. This is the palace of King Glele at Kana Myonghi, located right here. So we're able to find numerous palace sites across the region. Mapping and dating those sites allows us to say something really interesting about the expansion of Dahomean power over the history of the Atlantic exchange, the period of Atlantic exchange. This is color-coded by period, the map on the right. So you'll notice the red triangles are palaces from the 17th century. The orange squares are palaces from the 18th century, and then the yellow circles are all 19th century sites. And pretty quickly, you know, and how you might ask, how did we date this? A lot of it was based on collecting pottery on the surface of sites. We could collect pottery that was datable, but most of the dates came actually from oral historical work, and I would sort of tack back and forth between asking people when the things were built and collecting ceramics and artifacts and seeing if the two stories matched up. And in general, they matched up quite well. And the oral histories allowed me to date most of these to the construction of a particular king, and then the ceramics would confirm that at least they were in the right century. The pattern that emerged from that work that I did way back when was quite interesting. 17th century palaces are really restricted to Abomey, the emerging capital of the kingdom. And then in the 18th century, right after King Agaja conquers Alada and Wada on the coast and starts trying to centralize state control over the slave trade, what do Dahomean monarchs do? Well, they start building more palaces at Kana. Excuse me, I went forward too fast. They build other palaces along trade routes to the coast, and historical references talk about even more palaces farther to the south on that trade route. And so I think what the kingdom is doing is they're expanding out on that trade route to centrally control it, to secure it for their own profit. What happens in the 19th century is equally interesting, and all of these yellow dots represent palace structures distributed across the landscape. And you'll remember from my introduction, this is happening just after the transition to the palm oil economy, right? When the slave trade is declining because of abolition, and Dahomey has an opportunity to transition to the export of palm goods, palm products, they start pushing out into the countryside. For a variety of reasons I don't have time to talk about today, I don't think they're actively managing rural agricultural affairs, but I think they're putting palaces out in the countryside, at marketplaces and on waypoints to tax all the kinds of mercantile activity that starts to happen in the countryside as the economy, the rural economy, begins to grow. So that work gave me kind of a framework to think about the expansion of the Dahomean state in this period. One of the next steps is I wanted to get inside the palaces to get a better sense of who it was that was involved in doing all this work. Who were the agents? Who were the people who were actively involved in expanding and conquering this region? And more importantly, how can we see the emergence of new kinds of social identities? And how can we see that emerging microcosm of the Dahomean state, largely, by women, take place and unfold behind the walls of the Dahomean royal palaces? Most of this work has focused, or this part of my work, I should say, is focused on palaces at Kana. By the 19th century, 6 palaces had been constructed. Here are the ground plans that we mapped all of them about 15 years ago, and you get a sense of their scale. They're really quite large. This one's about the same size as the palace at Abomey. And the oral histories suggest that these were being built by successive kings from the early 18th century. This is the palace by King Agaja, the conqueror, all the way up to the 19th century. And we have actually evidence for the conquest of Dahomey by French Senegalese forces in 1894 at this site right here. So they really span the entire history of the kingdom. I've conducted very limited excavations across all of these sites, really focusing on just small domestic areas, trying to hit trash pits and trash mounds to get a sample of material culture that can begin to answer some of these questions that interest me. The range of material culture we get from these sites is absolutely fascinating, and I could have 100 dissertations written on each of these things. Lots of domestic material culture. They're extremely rich sites. And we find everything from locally produced tobacco pipes, lots of local pottery, that's the majority of what we find, grindstones for grinding corn, and then very rarely we find hints of possibly other identities, people from different ethnic backgrounds living behind the royal palace walls. This up here is very typical Dahomean pottery. This, what you're looking at on the bottom right, is extremely anomalous. And I've been told by my colleagues in Nigeria that it's very similar to pottery that shows up, sites associated with the Kingdom of Oyo, a Nigerian Yoruba kingdom. And we find this in one site in one time period in a very, very tightly dated context. And so this is, it's possible that female potters from the Yoruba world are being incorporated into Dahomean palace life in this particular period. That maps out with our historical understanding of the multi-ethnic nature of these contexts. We also find a lot of material in those excavations that speak to the various ways that Dahomean women behind palace walls may have been expressing social status. Lots of evidence of adornment, things like beads of various kinds, ivory rings, ivory and metal bracelets. All of this represents various ways that women were adorning themselves and might possibly relate to status distinctions that are emerging within the palace sphere. Having access to that stuff would say something about your social status to people who did not have access to that material in that context. Some of the more interesting but not surprising artifacts that we found are also pieces of gun equipment. Here you have two locks from flintlock rifles that I think, I'm no expert on guns, but I think they might be a kind of rifle called a Brown Bess, which is an early 19th century flintlock rifle. These were found in a late 19th century context, right? So old guns being maintained and used for probably 60 or 70 years by women soldiers living behind palace walls. These are other bits and pieces of the guns, triggers, things like that, and the flint itself. And then, of course, one of the largest categories of data we find are imported material culture. Things like bottle glass fragments, fragments of ceramic plates, tobacco pipes, and cowrie shells that were imported into Dahomey in this period. And we know, again, from the historical work, that this material was so important for Dahomean monarchs to symbolize and accentuate their power and status distinction within the kingdom. What's surprising is that we find a lot of this stuff in these interior domestic zones, and we seem to find more of it in the 19th century than we do in the 18th century. And that speaks to, again, maybe some of the kind of status competition that might be unfolding within the palace sphere at this time. A number of years ago, I had a student who was getting a PhD at zooarchaeology, and she was interested, Annika Jansen, she was interested in looking at this material and trying to get a sense of the nature of foodways behind palace walls, with some really interesting results too. She looked at all the specimens that we had collected and identified a pattern of faunal consumption, of animal consumption, that really just blows my mind to this day. Folks were eating anything and everything under the sun they could get their hands on. I mean, really, it was a really high protein rich diet. Everything from sheep and cattle and small deer, all the way up to elephants. They had access to an enormously rich variety of faunal resources. But what's interesting about her analysis is that the way they prepared them reflects modern culinary practices to this day. Food was largely unburned. This chart down here shows you that the majority of these specimens were unburned. And they were also chopped up. A lot of the bones had cut marks all over them, chopped up and hacked up into small pieces. And this chart on the bottom right just shows you the sort of histograms of size categories for different phases of occupation at one site. But you'll notice they're all pretty small. You're chopping these fauna into smaller bits to throw them into stews and cook them in pots like this, right, representing foodways that continue all the way into this day in the region. One of the questions we had about everyday life behind palace walls was, what was the scale of food production and what could that tell us about social organization at this site? Anyone that's tried to cook a meal for a large group of people knows that big pots or big meals take big pots. Whereas if you're just cooking for yourself or if you're cooking for your family, you might need a much smaller pot. And so looking at things like size categories or the size of the vessels that people were used to cook in can tell you a lot about the scale of food production as well as the scale of social organization. And so I asked, Was food production here large scale and communal, like sort of a mess hall kind of scale of production? Or was it small and more intimate, household centered, decentralized within palace contexts? I've done a lot of work on typological work on ceramics, and Dahomean ceramics are pretty straightforward. There's about 5 or 6 different varieties that we find a lot of, and they're used for lots of different things. You have big jars and little jars with outcurved rims and incurved rims, and all of these can be used for cooking or storage at different scales. One of the interesting things that we noticed, and here's 2 examples of a small cook pot and a large cook pot. When you look at the distribution of burnt sherds or sooty sherds, pot sherds that have lots of charcoal caked on it from cooking, almost 95% of all of our sooty sherds come from very small or medium-sized vessels. And so that tells us that's what people were cooking in. They were not cooking in the big vessels. They were cooking in those smaller vessels, like the kind of pot you might cook spaghetti sauce or soup for your family of 5 or 6. That says something interesting about social life behind these palace walls, right? There wasn't some large top-down organized meal preparation. Women were probably forming social groups. They were forming smaller social groups, something akin to households. I use the term family loosely, but they were finding their people and connecting and establishing a social life at a more intimate scale. The last thing I'll talk about in relation to that theme, and I'll sort of go through this relatively quickly because I realize I'm already running out of time, is the data that I just presented was very sort of general, and it was collected from lots of different sites and somewhat decontextualized, right? All that material was coming from trash pits across 6 palace sites in 2 centuries. About a decade ago, I wanted to contextualize those patterns and go into 1 or 2 palace sites and try to understand spatially where some of those things are taking place. And so we targeted first a site called the Palace of King Agaja at Kanatota. It's remembered in the oral histories as having been constructed by Agaja at Kana, right, when he first began to establish his suzerainty over the whole region. But then it was abandoned later in his reign and then reoccupied and renovated by King Gezo, a 19th century king who was involved in that shift from the slave trade to the palm oil trade, and is also remembered as sort of investing a lot of state resources into the Agogie, the women warriors. And he renovated this site as a training ground for the Agogie. We thought that would be a really interesting place to look at some of these questions over time. We ran a number of surveys and excavations at the site in 2010, and we adopted a method that many people in Virginia are probably very familiar with, shovel test probing, right? Rather than big, open, expensive excavations, we would drop small little probes systematically at relative intervals across the entire area. And then the artifacts we collect, we look at them spatially. We look for spatial patterns, density patterns that can say something about what people were doing and where. And some of the patterns that emerged from this work were really quite interesting, but really just scratching the surface, literally and figuratively. We noticed a number of different groups of high density artifact deposits. This group 4 up here lands right in Kanatota's KAJ complex, the public courtyard where lots of ceremonial activities take place. And this area was dotted with tons of imported material culture. And that, again, fits our kind of understanding of what people were doing in that space. This is a space where people are showing off and having ceremonies and distributing goods and things like that. This group down here, I'm not going to talk about it, was filled with fired clay. I'm not exactly sure what was going on there, but it was probably not domestic. But these 2 areas, group 1 and 2, had all the kinds of material culture that we expect in a residential quarter or in a collection of households. And so I'm imagining these as possibly 2 different household groups forming at this particular site. One of the interesting aspects of the material that recovered from these sites is that while they're consistent in some ways, they're very different in others. On the one hand, ceramics are pretty relatively evenly distributed across these 2, right? Speaking to the everyday nature of life at these places. but some goods are more heavily skewed towards one group than the other. Group 1, for example, has way more pipes in groundstone than Group 2. And Group 2 has a way more flake stone, glass, and iron than Group 1. And I honestly have no idea what these patterns mean at this point. We really need to go back to this site, excavate and find households to start saying something interesting. But I certainly think that this reflects some sort of specialization, right? That people in Group 1 are probably way more actively engaged in food preparation, as reflected from all the pipes, the groundstone. And then something going on over here with all these glass bottle fragments, and that might reflect a status. Maybe we have status distinction, maybe we have different social identities. It's really hard to say with this kind of surface data, but it points again to that complex and dynamic set of social identities that are taking root in palaces amongst palace women in this period. I'll just skip over that slide for time. Laura, how am I on time? Can I steal a few minutes, or do you want me to cut it short?
I think keep going. This is
okay.
Interesting.
Okay. So far I've talked about sort of the two angles of the project, looking at the emergence of the state from a regional level, and then drilling down into understanding who it was who was involved in the expansion of the state and trying to wrestle with some of the complexities of life behind palace walls. A third component of the project that I started in 2007 is really trying to target commoner communities outside of the palaces to get a sense of the degree to which they were articulated into the dynamics of the transatlantic exchange, to what degree they were resisting the imposition of state authority, and whether we could see any kinds of social networks that were emerging within village communities that allowed them to thrive and survive in this incredibly fraught era. And so this is a project that's perfect for classic survey archaeology. And so over a number of field seasons, I brought lots of students with me to Benin, and we walked all across the landscape around Kana. I decided to focus on Kana largely because I had really solid social relationships with the people in the community who were interested in this work, but also because it was one of the most important palace towns. And if I could wrap my head around where people were living and how that was changing over time, I could say something interesting about the history of the region. So this is a really hard slide to read, and I apologize, but the way we collected the data is not very conductive to lots of other visual representations. But what you're looking at here, this funny Pac-Man face, is our survey area. This is the area we actually looked at, and we just put on our hiking boots and got out there and walked all through this landscape. The red dots are archaeological features that we found on the landscape. These green triangles are actually baobabs, which are considered sacred trees in many parts of West Africa, but very much so in Benin. And they often mark village spaces. And you'll notice that some of those features in baobabs map out. They co-occur across this landscape. And then we collected artifacts in shovel test probes that we dug all across the region. And these blue circles represent sort of high density areas where lots of artifacts are showing up. And so if you can kind of hold your breath and tweak your head and close one eye, what you should see is a pretty complex landscape of settlements around those palaces. And it tapers off to some degree as you go to the east and into the south, with lots of settlement up here as well. Looking at the ceramics alone, we were able to distinguish the chronology of settlement across this region. And these are just density maps based on the current understanding of the pottery chronology. And the important thing I want to highlight is that we've got settlement across this region going all the way back to the first millennium AD and probably earlier. And it kind of bounces around and moves around all over the place. But in the 18th and 19th century, Kana goes supernova. And people settle there really quickly, and they settle right around the royal palaces that Dahomean kings constructed. So Kana is like a rapidly urbanizing community in the era of the slave trade, in the era where Dahomey gains control over the entire region. Wrestling with why we conducted a lot of oral histories with community members across Kana. We discussed the data we were finding and asked for oral histories from the heads of both royal and common or lineages. And the stories we got were really interesting. Almost universally, we were told of ancestors being captured or coming voluntarily after wars with neighboring states. And they described their ancestors as coming from the Mahi region in the north, or being Nago or Yoruba in the east, right? And there's always a sort of sense that there was conflict between states and then their people came here. And this is a pattern that's sort of a common narrative of enslavement and resettlement that we see in other parts of what was Dahomey and also in West Africa more generally. And they describe coming to serve various economic functions as laborers, as craftspeople, as priests, as bureaucrats. So it's a story about resettlement and the repopulation of towns and villages in Dahomey that's reminiscent of historical accounts as well as oral historical accounts in other contexts. This is just an example of a quote from Richard Burton where he cites, when the king breaks a town, he builds another and is supposed to place there the poor remnants of his captives. Right? So this was something that was recognized by Europeans as taking place in that period as well. So just a couple more slides and then I'll open it up for questions. Sorry, I'm going a bit later than I thought. But we wanted to understand what life was like for those folks who were either settled, either from far-flung regions or from more local regions in communities in and around Kana. So we launched a small-scale testing and excavation campaign at a number of village sites, both close to palaces and also more distant. And in general, we found some very interesting patterns. The archaeological remains, the household structures are very poorly preserved, so they're hard to talk about. But the material remains are very distinct. Unlike the extremely rich diets of the palace, we found almost no fauna at all, almost no animal bones recovered at these archaeological sites. That doesn't mean people weren't eating meat, but they were probably eating a lot less of it. And they were probably chopping up and processing that fauna in such a way that it degraded much more efficiently in the local acidic soils. So I wouldn't take that to assume that they were vegetarians. But they're not eating the quantity and scale of animal remains that we see in the Kana palaces. In terms of the material assemblages, they're almost universally dominated by locally produced ceramics, and then very scant pieces of imported material culture, the occasional or stray pipe, a bit of imported 19th century whiteware, or the fragment of a gin bottle, but very little stuff. At this one site, Kana Ganjipenji, these are the only imported material items we found. Right, so that speaks to a real disjuncture between the vast quantities of wealth that are moving into royal palaces as a result of Dahomean expansion and local rural communities that are largely kept separate. They're excluded from that trade. The last thing I want to comment on before I end is that we're beginning to see evidence for how people across rural communities responded to both the expansion of the slave trade as well as the expansion of the Kingdom of Dahomey. And this comes from a series of surprise features that a Danish team started identifying across the Abomey Plateau about a decade and a half ago. And these are called ahwando, which means war chamber. They are sites dug literally into the lateritic rock of the landscape. They're referred to often in the literature as souterrains, underground structures. The Danish team led by Klaus Ronsborg and Inga Mirketi have documented hundreds of these sites across the regional landscape. And in excavating them, they seem to date to the era of the transatlantic slave trade. They produce material culture that's consistent with 17th through 19th century occupations. And again, they're remembered in local oral histories as ahwando, these war chambers. And so some have thought that maybe they had something to do with an organized Dahomean military set of tactics. I actually think that they might have been a response to external slave raiding. When you look at a regional scale, the distribution of these sites, you'll notice here's Abomey. I should have labeled these towns better. Here is Abomey and here is Kana, and you have this extremely high density concentration of Ahwando just to the east of those two capitals, in the direction of the Kingdom of Oyo in Nigeria. And Oyo was Dahomey's principal rival and was constantly sending its cavalry down to invade Dahomey in the 18th century. So it's possible that these things were constructed by local families as a defense tactic. Local families were largely left on their own, the state's not doing anything to really protect them. So they're building these things to hide, probably, when slave raiders from Oyo march southwest to Abomey. Interesting, however, playing with spatial statistics, which is something I like to do, you can sort of expand or shrink your scale of analysis. And if you do a much smaller scale of analysis, limiting your range of comparison, an interesting pattern emerges. And that is that a lot of these Ahwando are clustering right on the edges of what we would think as archaeologists would be territories of control between royal palace towns. Each of these octagons is a royal palace town. So these Ahwando are almost constructed as far away from palaces as one can get. And that speaks to me at the local level of some level of political antagonism between, or spatial antagonism between rural village communities and the palace elite, right? They're trying to get away from them or maybe hide their stuff. We know in the historical record of Dahomean tax collectors marching through town, counting up people's livestock, taking cowries, taking material culture, taking young girls to be sent off to the royal palace to serve all of those political functions I described below. And I just imagine it likely that rural communities were figuring out ways to obfuscate the political gaze of the Dahomean state. I'll end on this one quote that I think speaks to the rural ambivalence of state power. It was written down or quoted in on Forbes' volume from 1851, where he describes a public ceremony where the court jesters come out and make obvious fun of the king in his attempts to extract wealth from rural communities. Forbes wrote, "At last the court fools reached the foot of the throne. They explained that from a great distance they had brought these baskets of corn and burdens of firewood to present them to the most liberal, generous monarch in the known world. Exhausted, nature apparently gave way. The carriers tottered and falling, exposed baskets of shavings of straw and bundles of pith and bamboo." So sort of symbolically and in a ceremonial context, poking fun and expressing the desire of rural communities to obfuscate, again, the political and economic gaze of the state. So I will end there. Thank you so much for your attention, and sorry for going a little bit longer than I expected to. I do want to acknowledge all the research funding that I've had for this project over the years. I've received a large amount of funds from the University of California Office of the President, the UC Santa Cruz Committee on Research, the UCLA Coates Institute of Archaeology, and multiple grants from the Winter-Gren Foundation and the National Geographic Society. I also could not have ever gotten any of this work done without collaborators at the University of Abomey and the Direction du Patrimoine National in Benin, and of course, dozens and dozens of students, some of whom have come from Howard University in the last couple of years, and community members who have contributed their extensive time and valuable time and effort to this project. So thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you.
Yay, that was wonderful. So we have a couple minutes for some questions. There are 3 that were dropped in the Q&A if you want to start with those. Cameron, can you see those?
Yeah. So Marvin has asked, can you tell us if there were any clues or artifacts you may have found or learned of the Dahomean presence in northern Haiti, particularly any connections to Henri Christophe's rule for 1806 to 1820? Somebody has been reading my mind. The answer is complicated. No, we found nothing that looks Haitian, nothing that looks explicitly Haitian. I started working after, so just to back up a bit, In 2013, I took a break from research in Benin to write it up. This is one of the problems that a lot of archaeologists, there's some folks in this Zoom who understand. You spend all this time digging, and then you don't have any time devoted to actually writing up the research, and it sits in your garage or your lab for the rest of your life. And then you get old, and then you get tired, you don't feel like doing it. So I decided to take a break from field work in Benin to get that research done. That break happened to coincide with the devastating earthquake of Port-au-Prince. And Haitian officials sent out a call for people experienced with cultural heritage work to volunteer their time and research energies to do field work in Haiti. And I was offered the opportunity to work at Henri Christophe's palace at Sanssouci. And that was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that I could not turn down. So rather than getting all that work written up, I took on another project and started doing field work in Haiti, and worked there for 4 years before the political crisis got too difficult to continue field work. And in that 4 years of work, we didn't find anything that looked explicitly Dahomean. In surveys, and we didn't do any excavation beyond Christophe's palace, but we walked around a lot. And we also find lots of Afro-Caribbean material culture, but nothing that looks explicitly Dahomean. There is a very explicit memory of the Dahomean presence in Haiti. It's embedded in the national identity that Dahomeans were an important component of the project that Christophe built. But no, nothing explicitly that looks like something where I'm holding two artifacts on either sides of the, two artifacts in my hand thinking, oh, these could come from the same place. Nothing explicit like that. Is Marvin still here? Does that answer your question? Okay. Oh, Chris. Hey, Chris. Chris asks, did you find sites of iron production? If so, did they coincide spatially with central governmental places or more decentralized? That's another really interesting question. So yeah, you find lots of evidence for iron production, but the history of iron production in this region is a little bit complicated. You have iron production going back to the end of the first millennium BC. It's a very ancient tradition across West Africa. The Danish team, led by Ransburg and Mercati, they've excavated and dated a lot of that material. We tend to find evidence for iron production, mostly large slag mounds, right? They're very common across Africa. It's the waste product from producing iron. People just chuck it over their shoulders, and you end up with these massive multi-meter high mounds. We tend to find those up until around the 16th century. And then the tradition dies off. The chronology is a little bit off, so it's hard to know if iron production ended at the exact same time that the Dahomey started waging campaigns for captives for sale on the coast, or if there's some gap in that period. But it definitely seems like iron production kind of peters out by the 16th century, and that's probably related to deforestation. This area is an area that has been relatively deforested for a few thousand years. The Benin Gap, the Dahomey Gap, is a sort of open savanna, wet savanna landscape between the dense forests of Nigeria to the east and Ghana to the west. And so it's possible that it deforested around the 16th century. And I have a theory that maybe I shouldn't say in public, but I actually have a theory that's one of the reasons Dahomey was able to expand politically across the Abomey Plateau in this period, that people who were producing iron and had economic connections to the north suddenly lost those connections and were looking for other kinds of leadership that could connect them into other worlds. And King Agaja and others had a southern sort of outlook and connected into the Atlantic world in that way. And that may have been one of the spurs that allowed them to take root and expand in that period. Let's see, lastly, Ivy, could you please talk us through how labor was mobilized for palm oil cultivation and how this is related to urban settlement and the palace spheres? Was there a shift from high-density urban areas to more diffuse settlements? Did the enslavement of Mahi Yoruba continue? That's an excellent question. It's a very important one. And it's something that that is often missed in sort of popular conceptions about the Kingdom of Dahomey. We tend to think about the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade as the end of slavery in West Africa, but in reality, it actually accentuated it in contexts like this. We know from the oral record, we know from historical documents that when the Agasuvi dynasty shifted towards an economy based on palm oil exports, they needed labor to produce these agricultural products. And they founded plantations across their landscapes and began to experiment with forms of slavery that look a lot more like chattel slavery in the New World. And so that in some contexts, like Dahomey, the transition to palm oil economies actually increased slave raiding and increased interpolitical competition for access to labor. But you have everyday people participating in the palm oil trade too. So on the one hand, you have wealthy elites and kings establishing palm oil groves and plantations. You also have, any guy with a pot and a palm tree can effectively participate in Atlantic commerce in this period. So that's one of the reasons why the entire economy sort of decentralizes and kingdoms struggle to control it, because everybody can participate at this point. And so you need other ways of profiting from that kind of economic activity. But yeah, the answer to your question is yes, the enslavement of Mahi and Yoruba very much did continue well into the 19th century. Any other questions? Should I look in the chat?
I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions.
Sure, if anybody wants to throw one out there or raise their hand, perfect.
I guess not. Cameron, do you have any last words that you want to share with us?
Yes, I should also note that I've been collaborating with Flory and Eleanor and Anna, who are in the room, with one of the UC-HBCU grants that many folks at Howard University know about to bring people into the field. Our plans are a little bit up in the air this year, but we should be making an announcement soon about what that's going to look like. Historically, we've been able to bring 4 or 5 students from historically Black colleges and universities, and we've always had students from Howard come to learn field training and get field experience on the ground. So we took students in 2022 to Benin, and we're hoping to do so again this upcoming year. So any of the students in the room, keep your eyes posted for an announcement that should be going out in the next month or so. And thank you all so much for your attention. I really appreciate this opportunity.
Thank you, Cameron. That's great. This is Eleanor.
Yeah, students, we'll keep you guys posted definitely of opportunities. And Cameron, thank you so much for sharing your research with us. That was you've done a ton of work. From an archaeological perspective, it seems like just years and years of research. So that's really wonderful. It was really great to actually hear what you've accomplished since we last talked. So,
thank you so much. I appreciate that.
With that said, good night, everybody. Thank you for joining us, and see you next time.
Thank you. Thank you to the Center for African Studies also for sponsoring this. It was great, and to the AIA. Thank you.
And the Department of African Studies and the Department of Political Science. So we will have another one. The African Archaeological Speaker Series is planned once a year. So we'll have another one, if not more, coming up. All right. Good night, guys. Thank you.